Hi everyone, it's Florence. I'm an Archaeogaming researcher and heritage consultant. And as you can probably tell, I'm very British. In the last conference that Bali hosted in the Netherlands in 2018, I discussed how Archaeogamers use maps as a means of recording video games. This time, I'm looking at photography. This presentation won't be like others that I've done, and that's not just because it's online. 2020 has been a difficult year for everyone, and I'm no exception. One of my main arguments in this presentation will be that as digital archaeologists, we should record the context of our own labour, and not just screenshots. The last few months, I've even found myself watching the world from out of my kitchen window, judging the pigeons on the building opposite that don't social distance. Okay, but now back to video game photography and being very serious, of course. First, I'm going to explore the different forms that photography takes in video games, starting with gameplay. One of the best known photography games is Pokemon Snap, a first-person game in which you try to take pictures of Pokemon, rather than catching them like you normally do. Susan Sontag may as well have been talking about Pokemon Snap when she wrote that to collect photographs is to collect the world. There is definitely a kind of colonial reading to be had from gameplay, which is about capturing information and cataloguing through photography. This is also something that happens in Beyond Good and Evil, but it's a bit different. In the sci-fi action-adventure game, protagonist Jade takes pictures of animals for a science museum, so far very similar to Pokemon Snap. But she is also a photojournalist who used photographs to gather evidence against a military dictatorship, so it's an overtly political game. Umurangi Generation, released just this year, is a post-apocalyptic photography game created almost entirely by Maori developer Naftali Faulkner, who currently lives in Australia. Faulkner was partly inspired to make the game as a response to the Australian government's mishandling of bushfires and negligent response to the climate crisis. Over time, the Pokemon Snap model of photography as personal mastery has been subverted. In some games, photographs form part of the environmental storytelling, or appear as objects that the player can interact with. In the Town of Light, real archival photographs of the asylum that the game is set in were actually included in the game, perhaps to add a sense of authenticity. In the walking simulator Gone Home, photographs of just one kind of object that the player can pick up, but they're particularly personal. And in this case, the Polaroid is a mnemonic for the early 90s in which the game is set, and of a flourishing queer relationship between two young women. My last example here is Life is Strange, which does include photography as a game mechanic, but also has photographs as extensions of characters' identities. In this case, the protagonist can choose to mess up the photo display of another student. As Barth says, photographs are mortal, and that includes digital photography, as well as photographs in video games, which, like all software, is subject to code rot. A classic screenshot. As Jazz Rignall reminds us, this actually used to be a shot of a screen, as game hardware did not allow for shareable screenshots. I was recently playing a remaster of Ocarina of Time on the GameCube, and the only way I can capture gameplay is through taking an actual photograph of my TV, as you can see here. In contemporary gaming, screenshots are a way of quickly capturing important or interesting moments, whether that be success in the online social deception game Among Us, or a thinly veiled reference to Donald Trump in the wonderful visual novel Butterfly Soup. Many games have now moved beyond just enabling screenshots to embracing video game photography by offering dedicated photo modes. This includes The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, in which the Sheikah Slate, a multi-purpose tablet that allows protagonist Link to create bombs, move magnetic objects, and yes, take selfies. According to an article by Yannick Lejac, video games started to encourage players to take selfies in the same year that selfie was named Word of the Year by Oxford Dictionaries, which was 2013. The Nintendo Switch has an inbuilt screenshot sharing function that allows you to post photos onto Twitter. So although games like Animal Crossing New Horizons also have a dedicated photo mode that is accessed through an in-game device, even with Instagram-like filters, as you can see here, ultimately by sharing photos on social media, you are marketing the game to your followers. In a 2018 article for Vice, Dia Lucena argued that video game photo modes are particularly significant for marginalised people who might not otherwise have access to traditional photography. What about archaeology in photography? Okay, let's rewind all the way back really far to the 1940s, when Sir Mortimer Wheeler was Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. At this time, India was under colonial British rule. You can see here a picture taken during Wheeler's excavations at Harappa, in what is now Pakistan. Ashish Chadha argues that Wheeler used the local workers not just as manual labourers, but objectified them in his photography as a means of legitimising his colonial production of archaeological knowledge. So, British archaeological photography and photographical conventions are rooted in this colonial history. Indeed, many archaeological photographic conventions have remained consistent from the 1940s, such as the use of a ranging rod scale. Charlotte Carter argues that the ranging rod and its placement in archaeological site photography formed a key part of the development of a scientific aesthetic since the 1960s, as informed by the concern over archaeology as a scientific discipline, which is characterised as the processual movement. In Colleen Morgan's 2016 article, Analog to Digital, she reflects on the anxiety over the change to digital photography since the 1990s, due to it potentially being much easier to edit images and to doctor them. This followed on from the post-processual movement in archaeology of the 1970s to 80s, which questioned the authority and objectivity of knowledge production in archaeology. Morgan points out that there are now vast quantities of digital photography and archaeological archives to be processed, and digital cameras allow for the instant viewing and interpretation of images on site. Here I've got a photo of Richard Atkinson. Sure, he's got a scale, but unfortunately his shadow is in the photo. That's a big no-no in archaeological photography because it obscures the photograph and potential interpretation of the archaeology and stratigraphy there. That being said, this faux pas actually makes the photograph all the more interesting over 60 years later, as it provides us an insight into the kind of equipment he was using and provides a human element to the photograph. I was thinking that the equivalent of casting your shadow as an archaeogamer would be the accidental capture of the screenshot capture alert within the screenshot. You know, the thing that comes up when you try and take a screenshot on your computer screen. A pristine screenshot might look much more professional. This screenshot of the Bradwell conspiracy actually captures a bit more of my process of playing a game on Steam than it might have done otherwise. So, we've looked into different forms of photography as gameplay, games photography and the history of photography as an archaeological method. But how should we record video games photographically as archaeogamers? Should we be using the same conventions of that we use in analog photography, such as the photoscale and North Arrow? In most cases, there aren't ways of measuring the in-game space in a way that would correspond with archaeological photographic conventions. One method is to annotate screenshots, as I've done here in a screenshot of a map in Near Automata. This is an interesting example because, in a way, it's a photography of an in-game map, providing the same kind of bird-eye view that you would expect from aerial photography. In Invisible Diggers, Paul Everall discusses how commercial archaeologists are often completely invisible in site reports that do not allow for individual practitioners' interpretations. Site photographs often only record the archaeological features themselves, which isn't exactly surprising, unless there are staged working shots. I was wondering what the archaeogaming equivalent of the working shot would be, and realised that the closest approximation would be a photograph of the archaeogamer playing the game themselves. After all, the context and experience of play isn't just the screen, it's the assemblage of player, hardware, software, and the wider environment that they're in as well. Of course, it's not that easy to take a picture of yourself while playing, as I found while trying to take a selfie with one hand while still holding my Switch in the other. It's not a good photograph, though it probably does tell you a bit more about me as a researcher than you would know if you hadn't seen it at all. Ideally, we would work together to capture our gameplay experiences, though of course during the pandemic this work needs to be remote. And of course, like in the case in the photo you can see above, photographs will be very staged. There's also the ethics of considering that people may have lots of different personal reasons for not wanting to photograph themselves, for their own privacy and security. These have just been some preliminary thoughts on archaeogaming and photography as a recording method. I would really love to hear what other people's experience has been of trying to record their gameplay using screenshots or photo modes for archaeological analysis. Of course, still images are not the only option. There is the possibility of recording gameplay footage as well, and I would certainly advocate for using a variety of different methods to record a game. We should also remember that focusing purely on photography would be to privilege an ocular-centric approach that may not be accessible for everyone. As I was doing this presentation, I started looking through my folder of screenshots and realised that I had my own little archive of video game photography. I wonder what you could learn about someone from their screenshots. My final thought would be, to paraphrase Austin Walker, as archaeogamers, we should record not just what play looks like, but what it feels like too. I will be uploading a full transcript and bibliography of this presentation on my website at florenceofnichols.com. Thank you for watching.